Alrighty, yo, what is going on, everybody? It's your boy, Mr. DDG94, here back with another reaction video. Today, we're finna react to Year in Review WWF in 2000. So, I started doing this series, like, I want to say about 2 years ago, I want to say. And, I stopped at 2009, but that was only because the person that was doing this, he didn't do the 2010s yet. So I think he recently just did the 2010s. I don't think he finished it though. I think he stopped at a certain point. But anyways, though, I'm gonna finish off the 2000s because we started at 2006. So we're gonna go from 2006 to 2007. I mean, to 2005, I should say. And then after that, we'll head into the 2010s and we'll go from there. So yeah, niggas decided not to upload shit today. So I gotta dig through the watch later list and find some videos for y'all. So this is the best I can find. So yeah, without further ado, man, let's get right into it.
The year 2000 was a huge year in pop culture. In television, Malcolm in the Middle first hit the airwaves. In film, Scary Movie was selling out theaters. And over in the world of wrestling, the WWF would be going through arguably its best year ever creatively.
Peak.
Yes, this was the
Peak
year
WWF.
where Stage 2 of the Attitude Era took over as, with the loss of Steve Austin and the introduction of a host of new great wrestlers, things would go to another level entirely. So join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 2000, a year in review. When we last left off, Triple H and Stephanie McMahon had taken over the show as the heel unit of the McMahon-Helmsley regime, and the Big Show was the WWF champion. That last point, though, would soon change when on the January 3rd episode of Raw, Triple H and his reformed DX lackeys would work together to help him get the title off the big man, with this allowing him to start his third reign on top. Meanwhile, around the time this was happening, the first of 38 hardcore title changes for the year would take place when Test won the belt. All while back in the main event, the McMahon-Helmsley regime were aiming their ire directly at Mick Foley. And though this was originally supposed to lead to Mankind versus Triple H at the first big show of the year, January 23rd's Royal Rumble, in the end, Mrs. Foley's baby boy would feel the need to morph into a far more sadistic incarnation so as to get the job done. That was why, when the time for the show came, it would be Cactus Jack who took on the game instead, with the match they put on ending up being arguably the best of the entire Attitude Era.
Facts.
And while for Foley, it gave him a chance to have one last hurrah in front of Madison Square Garden, for the incoming champion and eventual winner, it would allow him to finally reach that next level with fans, cementing him as a true main eventer in the process. But of course, that wasn't all that was happening that night. As well on the undercard, Taz would make his debut when he choked out Kurt Angle in just 3 minutes and 16 seconds. The Hardy Boys and the Dudley Boys would have a classic tables match, and Chris Jericho would become the undisputed Intercontinental Champion after beating Chyna and Hardcore Holly in a triple threat match. The main event would be all about The Rock. Yes, this was the night where, with Steve Austin temporarily gone, the Great One would rise to the top when, in the Rumble match itself, he outlasted 29 other competitors to win the whole thing. Well, kind of. As in actuality, a botched ending would see his feet hit the floor before the Big Shows did at the close of the bout, leading to the Giant technically being the victor. So, using this as part of the storyline going forward then, Paul White would demand a shot at The Rock at the next pay-per-view of the year, No Way Out, on February 27th, with the stipulation being that if he could pick up the win here, then he would go on to the main event of WrestleMania instead. Before we would get there, though, Kurt Angle would score his first gold with the company when he became European champion. Harvey Whippleman would briefly become the women's champion. Lita would make her debut when she helped Essa Rios to become the light heavyweight champion, and 4 of WCW's top prospects, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn, would collectively jump ship as the Radicals, with them immediately setting about establishing themselves as top guys by going after the McMahon-Helmsley regime. Of course, this was far from the only problem Triple H had at the time though, as, while that was going on, he was also having to deal with his upcoming rematch with Cactus Jack, one which would be held inside Hell in a Cell. So in an attempt to even the playing field, the game would demand that, this time, if Foley could not get the better of him, he would have to retire forever. And that led to the match between them at No Way Out then, where, after a brawl that lasted for 24 minutes and saw the challenger take another big bump through the cell, the champion would score the pinfall,
they went crazy in this one,
ending the career of his heated rival once and for all.
That was
Elsewhere on the show, meanwhile, Kurt Angle would defeat Chris Jericho to become the Intercontinental Champion. The Dudley Boys would capture tag team gold from the New Age Outlaws, and the Big Show, with a little help from Shane McMahon, would score a screwy victory over The Rock, stealing his WrestleMania main event away from him in the process. This then would lead to a series of segments in the weeks that followed, which saw the Great One find an unlikely ally in Vince McMahon, someone who had by now returned to the company to take back power and felt that the best way to do this was to add The Rock to the main event of WrestleMania so as to get the belt off Triple H. But that wouldn't be the end of the story, as the last McMahon, Linda, would also show up around this time too to announce that, rather than it being the triple threat match at the Showcase of the Immortals, there would be a fourth competitor, someone who had never gotten the chance to get his WrestleMania main event before, Mick Foley. And this would lead to the Big Show on April 2nd where, with a McMahon in every corner, all four competitors would battle it out to see who would become the champion. Before that night would come, though, Mae Young and Mark Henry's unlikely romance would end with her giving birth to a hand. Stephanie McMahon would bolster her stable's power when she became the women's champion, and another notable woman of the era, Trish Stratus, would make her debut as the valet of Test and Albert.
Shout out to Trish Stratus.
When WrestleMania came around on April 2nd then, she'd be in her team's corner as they took on Al Snow and Steve Blackman. Meanwhile, the rest of the undercard was being made up of a hardcore battle royal which saw Crash Holly's memorable 24/7 reign temporarily come to an end, Kane finally putting his long-standing feud with X-Pac to bed, Edge and Christian, the Dudley Boys, and the Hardy Boys changing the game for tag team wrestling with their triangle ladder match, and incoming Eurocontinental Champion Kurt Angle losing both of his titles during a triple threat match with Chris Benoit and Chris Jericho.
Top tier match.
Then in the main event, it would ultimately come down to two when, after the Big Show and Mick Foley had been eliminated, The Rock and Triple H would battle it out over the title. And while most expected this to be the Great One's coronation as top guy, fans would ultimately be thrown a swerve when, instead, Vince McMahon would turn heel on the challenger, screwing him out of the victory, as the Game became the first heel to win in the main event of WrestleMania. Not that this would be the end of the story though, as at the next pay-per-view of the year, Backlash on April 30th, just a few days after Chris Jericho had torn the roof off the place during Raw with a phantom WWF title win, the People's Champion would get his rematch, this time with the promise that none other than Stone Cold Steve Austin would be returning to stand in his corner. Before that happened though, Eddie Guerrero would charm Chyna with his Latino heat, causing her to turn on her now former ally Y2J and cost him his European Championship during a match between him and Guerrero. And that would lead to Backlash where, while Eddie was successfully defending his newly won belt against S.A. Rios, and his stablemate Dean Malenko was doing the same with the light heavyweight title in a hugely underrated match against Scotty 2 Hotty, the main event would see The Rock and Triple H finally go at it one-on-one. And this time, with the help of Stone Cold, who came out towards the end of the match to an absolutely earth-shattering pop and laid out the McMahon-Helmsley regime with a steel chair, the People's Champion would finally get the big win, as from there, he would start his fourth reign as WWF Champion. So taking his duties seriously then, he head over to the UK on May 6th for Insurrection, there successfully defending against both The Game and Shane McMahon. And to make matters even better, this time he'd be able to do it without the help of the Rattlesnake as, still technically recovering from neck surgery, Austin would disappear again for the next several months. Come the next US pay-per-view of the year though, Judgment Day on May 21st, it would be back to one-on-one competition, as there, with WWF on-screen commissioner Shawn Michaels acting as the special guest referee, The Rock and Triple H would attempt to settle things once and for all in an hour-long Iron Man match. Before that happened though, the undercard would see Shane McMahon defeat The Big Show in a last man standing match, Chris Benoit get the better of Chris Jericho in a submission match for the Intercontinental title, and Kurt Angle's comedy team with Edge and Christian go up against everyone's favorite dancing trio of Rikishi and Too Cool.
Yes, sir.
Then in the main event, the two top guys in the company would exhaust each other for a full hour, with it all eventually coming down to the wire as the score ended up being 5-5 with just a couple of minutes left. And that was when, after having been missing in action for the prior 6 months, The Undertaker would finally make his return to the company, albeit this time in a far different look. Yes, this was the debut of the American Badass, as shedding the deadman gimmick he'd carried for years up until then, Mark Calloway would ride down to the ring on a motorcycle so as to lay waste to the McMahon-Helmsley regime. Unfortunately for The Rock, though, this would lead to Triple H getting a last-second disqualification victory, and as a result, the overall win in the match. But even if he was now the champion once again, the game would have little time to celebrate, as from there, he'd be forced to prepare for 3 challengers at the next big show of the year, June 25th's King of the Ring. And that was because on this show, the main event would be a 6-man tag that saw the champion partner up with Vince and Shane McMahon to take on The Rock, The Undertaker, and Kane, with the stipulation here being that if any of the babyfaces pinned any of the heels, then they'd be the new champ. And of course, come the end of that match, it would be the People's Champion who stood tall once more after pinning Vince McMahon. But that wasn't the only noteworthy event coming out of the show, as, before this, Kurt Angle and then Intercontinental Champion Rikishi would make it to the finals of the King of the Ring, with their subsequent battle going for just over 5 minutes and seeing the Olympic hero come out on top. Sadly for him, though, his celebrations would be short-lived as, the very next night on Raw, a new foil would be introduced to both him and every other heel on the roster when Mick Foley replaced Shawn Michaels as the on-screen commissioner of the company. And aside from screwing with Kurt Angle, this would also see Mrs. Foley's baby boy set out to end the reign of terror the McMahon-Helmsley regime had instigated in the months preceding, with his first order of business being to name a new, more deserving #1 contender for The Rock's WWF title in Chris Benoit. So at the next big pay-per-view of the year then, fully loaded on July 23rd, The Rock would battle it out with the Rabid Wolverine, with the champion eventually picking up the win come the end. As far as the rest of the card, well, that would be made up of a number of notable matches, one of which saw Chris Jericho take on Triple H in a last man standing match. As well as that, Kurt Angle would take his next step towards the main event when he faced off against The Undertaker, all while the newly formed Acolyte Protection Agency were destroying Edge and Christian to win the tag team titles. Then, in further title action, Val Venis would defeat Rikishi in a steel cage match for the Intercontinental title, with this coming not long after Trish Stratus and Lita had found themselves on opposite ends of the ring for the first time when they took part in a mixed tag match with their partners TNA and the Hardy Boys respectively. And following that night, both women would even get to briefly become part of the main event scene when, while Lita was defeating Stephanie McMahon to win the Women's Championship on Raw's first ever women's main event, Trish would be forced to team up with Triple H during a tag team match on the Red brand, something which led the billion-dollar princess to begin suspecting the newcomer was having an affair with her husband. But this wouldn't be the end of the romance drama between the power couple as, while that was going on, Kurt Angle would develop a crush of his own on Stephanie, with this leading to the two of them repeatedly teasing something happening between them over the weeks that followed. Of course, unhappy with what the Olympic hero seemingly had planned for his wife then, the Game would start feuding with him soon after that. And all this would eventually lead to August 27th SummerSlam where, in a triple threat match for the WWF title, both men would find themselves going up against The Rock. Before that happened though, the undercard would see the remains of DX finally fizzle out when X-Pac defeated Road Dogg, Taz's fall from grace be further solidified when he lost to Jerry Lawler in just over 4 minutes, and the newly formed Right to Censor score a win over Rikishi and Too Cool. On top of this, the stacked card would also feature Chyna winning the Intercontinental title during a mixed tag team match, pitting her and her partner Eddie Guerrero against Val Venis and Trish Stratus. Steve Blackman sends Shane McMahon plummeting from the top of the scaffolding at the entranceway in an impressive stunt, and Chris Benoit get the better of Chris Jericho in a 2 out of 3 falls match for the Intercontinental title.
Top tier wrestling.
But that wasn't all, because after this, Kane and The Undertaker would go to a no contest, all while elsewhere, Edge and Christian, the Hardy Boys, and the Dudley Boys were blowing fans away again with the first ever tables, ladders, and chairs match. Then, once all this was done, the main event would see The Rock retain after Kurt Angle suffered a nasty concussion early on in the bout, with this causing the champion to splinter off into a 4-way feud with The Undertaker, Kane, and Chris Benoit from there, as Triple H and the Olympic hero set about settling their beef one-on-one. And as it happened, this showdown would come at September 24th's Unforgiven, where after just over 17 minutes, the Game would score the win. Elsewhere, meanwhile, as The Rock was retaining his WWF title once again in the main event Fatal 4-Way match, The Hardy Boys were continuing their string of bangers with Edge and Christian when they defeated them in a steel cage match to win the tag team titles, and Eddie Guerrero was successfully defending his Intercontinental title against Rikishi, the very same title he'd only recently won from China, in a slimy fashion. And while this would end up leading to them splitting up soon thereafter, as far as Unforgiven was concerned, the most noteworthy part of this show was still to come, as backstage, Stone Cold Steve Austin would soon arrive to continue his investigation into who had run him over the year prior, with this being something he'd only recently started doing upon his return to TV in the weeks leading up. But even if he didn't get the answers he was looking for on that night, they would come soon after, when on the October 9th episode of Raw, it was revealed that Rikishi had been behind the hit and run, with him at that point claiming he just wanted his cousin to have a chance of reaching the top instead, or as he put it, "I did it for The Rock." And of course, the fact that Rikishi wasn't even on the roster when Austin was run over didn't help to sell the whole thing. No, in fact, fans pretty quickly rejected the reveal as being a disappointing payoff to the entire angle.
Facts.
So, hoping to move past it quickly then, the Rattlesnake would absolutely brutalize Rikishi during their showdown on October 22nd's No Mercy, beating him to such a pulp that the match was eventually thrown out as a no contest. Aside from that, the rest of the show on this night would see Lita and Trish Stratus once again find themselves on opposite ends of the ring during a mixed tag match with TNA and the Hardy Boys. Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley host their own Dudley Boys Invitational Tables match, and Kurt Angle challenged The Rock for the WWF title in the main event. And what made this one more interesting was that, despite having been beaten by Triple H the month prior, the Olympic hero had managed to convince Stephanie McMahon to be his manager, a duty she carried out to perfection, as after just over 21 minutes, Kurt would pin the Great One to become world champion after less than a year on the roster. Yes, it had been quite a rise to the top, but it wouldn't end there.
Very
now
deserving.
Holding the top prize, the new champ would have to defend it against all comers, the first of which would be The Undertaker. And that match would come at November 19th Survivor Series where, fully being baptized by fire, Kurt was put through the ringer against the American Badass, only to somehow come out the end of things, leaving with his title still around his waist. Meanwhile, as this was going on, the rest of the card would see Ivory and Lita battle it out over the women's title, The Rock try to beat some sense into his cousin Rikishi, and Steve Austin take on Triple H, with this one coming about after the game had revealed it had been him who hired the big man to take out Austin a year prior in the hopes that he would get him out of the main event picture for good. So unleashing all his fury on his opponent that night then, the Rattlesnake would absolutely batter him all around the arena, eventually leading him to the parking lot where, after Triple H tried to escape in a car, Austin would raise it up on a forklift and drop it 30 feet to the ground. Yes, it was clear by now that the main event scene was becoming filled with so much chaos that something would have to be done about it. And that was why, after one more stop over in the UK for the December 2nd Rebellion show, Mick Foley would announce that at the final pay-per-view of the year, Armageddon on December 10th, the top 6 contenders would all face off against each other for the WWF title inside Hell in a Cell. And this, of course, would mean that having to defend his belt against Steve Austin, The Rock, Triple H, The Undertaker, and Rikishi, Kurt Angle was not happy about the situation.
And still came out on top.
He wasn't the only one left unhappy as it happened because, feeling like the commissioner was endangering a number of his biggest stars by putting them all in such a match together, Vince McMahon did everything he could to try and stop it going ahead in the weeks that followed. Before fans could find out if he'd been successful in this, though, the undercard of Armageddon would see Chyna fight Val Venus after the rights to censor had taken umbrage with her Playboy cover shoot, Chris Jericho defeat Kane in a last man standing match, and Chris Benoit become Intercontinental Champion again after beating Billy Gunn. Then in the main event, with the boss being unable to get the match canceled, things would quickly devolve into chaos as, while all 6 competitors brawled inside the cell, he would come out with a wrecking crew, fully intent on dismantling the whole thing before it could go any further. And despite Mick Foley coming out to eject the boss after he'd gotten the door off, by then, the damage was done. As now, with a pathway to the outside of the cage, the action would quickly spill out onto its roof where, in a far safer bump than Mankind had taken 2 years ago, Rikishi would be chokeslammed off the side. Meanwhile, back in the ring, the brawling would eventually leave every man so beaten up that, at a certain point, Kurt Angle was able to steal the pin on a prone Rock, allowing him to, from there, brag that he'd been able to beat every top contender at once. As for us, though, that's where we'll leave it for today, because this would mark the end of 2000. a year that, to this day, is still considered by many to be the creative peak of WWF.
Yes, sir.
Yes, it truly felt at this point like the boom period would never end, as with the company overflowing with star power both old and new, and WCW and ECW seemingly on the verge of death, there appeared to be no stopping the train.
And that's when 2001 came, and all that momentum just wasn't bad, but all that momentum though.
Push the goddamn button. Push the goddamn button.
It is what it is though.
That was until 2001 came around and things hit a bit of a snag, but we'll get there another day. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below.
Hey man, that's just gonna about do it for this one. Most definitely 2000 was peak WWE. Peak WWE. Tuned in every fucking day, bro. Especially SmackDown, bro. SmackDown was lit every fucking week, bro. Good times. Good times. But anyway, so that's just gonna about do it for this one. I'll see y'all in the next video. Till then, bye.